Again, welcome to today's Transcend Professional Development Core Didactic Training titled Effective Scientific Writing. We're fortunate to have Dr. Daniel Kenzie leading today's presentation. Dr. Daniel Kenzie is an assistant professor of pharmacy practice at North Dakota State University, where he teaches writing and critical thinking in the health professions. At NDSU, he received the Peltier Award for Teaching Innovation for his work addressing artificial intelligence in writing instruction. He also co-chaired the 2023 and 2025 Rhetoric of Health and Medicine Symposia and was instrumental in founding the new Rhetoric of Health and Medicine Society. His research investigates how people make meaning about health through language and how writing can be taught and learned in health professions and technical communication classrooms. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Kenzie.
Thank you, Kent, and thank you all for having me today. So I'll be talking about effective scientific writing, focusing on primarily on scientific manuscripts. I have a link to a Google Drive folder that has these slides as well as a handout. And if you'll take a look, if you want to take a look at the handout, it's really just a list of different aspects of writing, all sorts of different things from process strategies and work habits to organizing a manuscript to revising and editing. And so it'll be clear in a moment why I'm sharing that long list with you. So to start us off, I wanted to warm us up with a few questions. You don't have to answer all of them, but maybe at least one. Which aspects of writing do you struggle with? Which issues, if any, are you facing right now in a current project you're working on? Or what do you feel are your strengths as a writer, or something you enjoy? So any of these questions, just drop your answer in the chat. And maybe identify which question you're answering, either with the number or by making it clear in what you're writing, whether you're saying it's something that you struggle with or something that you feel is a strength. So I'll give you a moment to respond to at least one of those. But then I'll go ahead and move forward on my first few slides while those are coming in, and we'll circle back around to it. It could be anything at all to do with writing. Something we all have a history with and have feelings about one way or another. Yeah, and again, the link and the QR code go to the slides and that handout. So the handout is just there as a guide if it helps you get ideas for identifying issues that you struggle with or are a strength. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of great answers. So we'll come back to those soon. So keep those coming. So today I'll mostly focus on the components of the major sections of a research manuscript. That'll be a vehicle for talking about the content and logic of a manuscript. I've got more slides than we'll have time for likely, but they're there as a resource. So we can see how much time we have to talk about, different writing, editing, and productivity strategies and touching on AI as an emerging writing tool. But I'd like to start with a couple of principles, I guess, to get some ideas on the table. One is that writing is a learnable skill that we don't stop learning. So to take that first part, writing is a learnable skill. A lot of people can get ideas about, you might feel I'm not a good writer because, a teacher years ago told you you weren't a good writer, or some situation made you feel that way, or you might just feel like I'm I'm in the sciences. I'm focused on science. I'm not a writer. That's not my favorite thing. Um, but anybody can learn to write and can improve in writing through practice, intentionality, and ideally feedback. And I'll also say that writing is something we don't stop learning uh, because it's not just a basic skill that we just master in high school or college and then it's we've got it taken care of. There are always new genres, audiences, situations, organizations, or new roles or phases in our career that represent new writing challenges that we need to learn and adapt from. Specifically, a scientific manuscript is both a narrative story and an argument. So I'll piggyback off of what Dr. Carson was saying last month about uh, presentations telling a story. We might not always think of scientific manuscripts as telling a narrative story because that sounds more subjective than what we normally think about. But uh, it is telling a story in the sense of setting up, giving the background that sets up some kind of problem and tells us about some kind of response to the problem and a resolution of that problem. And a manuscript is also an argument, not maybe in the sense of really overtly trying to persuade people or change minds the way we might with public audiences, but it's still very much an argument, arguing for uh, that the problem or gap that you're trying to address is important, that your study was even worth doing, and that it was done rigorously and appropriately. An argument that the findings and conclusions are justified based on the data. And so those are just some main ideas that frame some of the things that we'll come back to over the session here. So I'm starting to see some of the responses that are coming in. Yeah, getting started, struggling with brevity and word limits. Yeah, totally. I can understand that. Overthinking or overcomplicating things. Yeah, and that can show up conceptually and in your sentences. Getting started, literature review. Oh yeah. Navigating and representing the literature effectively and appropriately is a big one. Getting things down and out of your head, confidence in getting started. Okay, yeah, um, we will come back to those for sure. So thanks for those responses. So I'll talk about IMRaD format. IMRaD is an acronym for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion that I'm sure is very familiar to many of you. And I'll just say too that I'm sure we have varying levels of experience in this group. A lot of you already have a lot of experience, but the I hope that if a lot of this feels like review, that not only are there some useful nuggets that can help generate your thinking, but that we can use some of that material still to set goals and have a good discussion. So IMRaD is it's not completely universal. There is some variability in how manuscripts are organized, but it's a very durable, consistent structure for reporting research that shows up not only in manuscripts, but everything from poster presentations to abstracts. Uh, and it's especially ubiquitous in medical journals, whereas in the sciences and engineering fields, there's a little more variability. You might see these sections in a bit of a different order, or combined, or split up, or called something different, but they don't just represent the organization of a manuscript or a set of buckets to put different kinds of information in. They represent an underlying structure and logic. So I'll, as we go through the different components here, I'll emphasize not just what goes in each section, but how the different sections are connected to each other, how they set up and build on each other in order to um, build that argument and build that logic. It's also worth remembering that these are arranged in a certain order, but readers might not read them that way. So you need to write your manuscripts um, in a way that makes sense to be read in order, but also can be read if someone really wants to uh, focus more closely on your results or your methods, or just read it in an order that's strategically useful for them. So I'll actually start. So title, I'm already splitting off from my list here because title wasn't on it. But I wanted to touch on titles. Uh, and you should be able to have a clear enough sense of the purpose of what you're writing that you can sum up, the purpose of your study or the purpose of your article in a sentence. So if you uh, just write out like a single sentence purpose statement, then you can use that as a starting point to develop a good title, just sort of like turn it from a sentence into a phrase. To give a quick example from a student project, uh, their purpose statement was something like, our study investigates the effects of decreased caffeine consumption on anxiety in pharmacy students. Take out sort of those extra words, turn it into a phrase rather than a sentence. That can be a pretty good title that encapsulates what you're up to. Oh, by the way, I'm not covering abstracts because abstracts follow the same structure as the whole manuscript, right? Just in miniature. Next, the introduction section. So this slide is focused on something called the CARS model. CARS is an acronym for Create a Research Space. And the CARS model came from corpus research. Corpus research studies writing by collecting a large data set of texts. So a linguist named John Swales, John Swales studied research articles across disciplines all across the academy and found that research introduction sections consistently make three major moves. Establish the territory, where you describe the topic and why it's important. And you might bring in outside literature to establish that. Then establish the niche, or niche, I guess, where you're narrowing it in a little bit more to a specific gap or other need within that larger territory. So that can be identifying a gap. It can be more like showing how you're continuing the tradition, or you're extending other studies, or maybe working against previous studies if you feel there were specific limitations that weren't addressed, or in some way establishing the problem or need. And that segues into occupying the niche by describing the specific objectives of your study. So the link here gets into this in much more detail with lots of examples of the different sorts of ways specifically that those moves can be made. But if you want an example of this, look at pretty much any research article in your field, and I think you'll see them making those three underlying moves, even if it looks a little bit different. And then with the methods section, some readers might gloss over the methods. Some journals even put methods at the end because some readers might be most focused on, okay, what did you find? What do you conclude from it? What are the main takeaways on the substance of what you studied? But they can also be highly scrutinized by other readers, certainly by experts in that area, and certainly by editors and reviewers. And so I mentioned that the overall manuscript is an argument. The methods section is an argument that is trying to establish that the research was thorough, accurate, done appropriately. So it's a narrative of what you did and why, and it's often the section that has the most flaws or can be a cause of rejection. I'll also say too that you probably know that meta-analyses and systematic reviews aggregate a large number of studies on a specific topic. They do so with really specific inclusion criteria, and you can conduct the best study ever that's a perfect fit for their inclusion criteria, but it might get left out of those meta-analyses and systematic reviews if they can't tell if your study meets the inclusion criteria, which is a writing issue. So having those critical details that a range of different reviewer or different readers need, whether that's reviewers, looking at your manuscript, or even just a reader who needs to understand, where did your data come from? Like, what even is this? That's what the method sets up. And so again, back to how these sections are connected to each other, it should be clear how the methods match the research question. They should logically follow from the research question. We should see why you did it that way based on what you were looking for. And they set up the context that helps us understand what we're looking at when we get to the results. So here's an unsurprising list of questions that methods often answer. So you can think of it as the questions that a range of readers will have that this section is trying to answer about what you did and why. Then results. So you might think of this as an especially objective section. You're presenting the data, but there's a lot of decisions that go into what order to present them in, how much detail to go into, and how can you really make clear how the data are addressing the problem that you identified in the introduction section. And then the results form the evidence for whatever claims you make in the discussion or conclusion. I didn't bring a lot specifically about graphs, but it's important to choose a type of graph that is the best choice for showing what you want to show about the kind of data that you have, and making sure that they're appropriately scaled, labeled, placed, and contextualized in the text of your manuscript. And then discussion. The discussion section synthesizes and interprets the data. I have a colleague who said that she struggles the most with discussion sections because she feels she doesn't want to go out on a limb too much, right? Because that's where you're departing the just objective facts of what the data are and giving what's hopefully a valid interpretation. And again, the discussion section is also an argument. It's an argument for how the data answer the research question, and also how the findings can be applied beyond the study into practice and future research. So the major moves here are presenting, recapping the major findings from results, placing those findings within the context of published literature, and exploring the significance of the research. I guess I almost want to take a moment for questions, but if you have questions, you can continue to drop them in the chat, and we'll circle around to them. I did want to touch on tailoring to a specific journal. Once you've chosen a likely journal that's appropriate for your research, um, looking at the aims and scope. So any journal should have a statement of what kinds of, like what their mission is, what their values are, and the kinds of things that they publish. So looking at the aims and scope to make sure that it's on target for that journal. The author guidelines or submission guidelines are worth looking at closely, which is obvious. I mean, why wouldn't you read those? But sometimes something pretty important is kind of buried in there and you miss it on the first read or two. And then the nice thing about writing for publication is that publications have lots of examples because that's the point of a publication. So looking up example articles in that journal that are as close as possible to the kinds of research you're doing and kind of look for patterns and reverse engineer what you're seeing for how you can put that into practice with your writing. So I've been talking so far about the moves that different sections make. So that's a way of thinking about reading for not only um, what an article is saying, but what it's doing, what it's trying to accomplish, in what order, and how it's accomplishing it. So you can read for those moves and for the organization, or for style, or for any number of things. See how if there's a consistent pattern, something that all of the articles are doing, so you should make sure to do it, or things that the articles really vary on, then that's a sign that you have some leeway to set it up in a way that's appropriate for your instincts and your study. I can come back around to this uh, in a bit, but if you're thinking about productivity strategies, and I think um, a lot of you talked about getting started, uh, but if you're just thinking about work habits and productivity, these two links are good ones. The first one is to an article about what they're calling the 1 hour workday. So that just means, too often we think, okay, we need time to even get our head in the zone, and then we need to let plenty of time to work. So you might only make time for your writing projects when you have a lot of time to work with, but then you sort of binge write or like really put in a lot of work in, and then because you put so much time into it, need to get back to the rest of your job, then you let it sit for a while. And then when you let it sit, it's even harder to get back into it. So the argument that article is making is if you can get practice with writing for shorter bursts and for shorter periods of time, because that sustained attention and sustained engagement of many many shorter sessions, whether that's one a day or one a week, depending on the nature of your job and the nature of the project. That sustained attention to it is what will actually get you get it done. So that goes hand in hand with, if you're just familiar with time blocking as a strategy, just placing dedicated time that you commit to the same way you would an appointment, uh, sort of an appointment with yourself to put the time in with writing. And then I don't know if you've heard of the Pomodoro method. I find it useful. That's a link to an explanation of the Pomodoro method. It's just a way of structuring your time into, working in 25-minute chunks and then having brief 5-minute breaks, and then occasionally taking longer, more substantive breaks. And that forces you to break big tasks into small tasks and then bundle tasks that are already small. Uh, and that allows us to give our brains the breaks they need while also uh, putting in that sustained attention in a manageable amount of time before you give yourself that break. Again, happy to talk more about any of these if that's useful. I wanted to touch on editing. Actually, I'll start with my second point, that it's worth separating revision from editing. Revision being the larger scale, bigger changes for the content and how it's organized, so that you're not getting too invested in the nitty gritty of your sentences before you get the big picture stuff done. So get those big picture revisions done first before you bother yourself too much with fine-tuning sentences. Look for areas for continuous improvement. That's an idea I'll come back to, and try to give it sustained practice. That's how you get better. The more you put intentional practice into the things you need to work on, then the more it'll become habit, and the more it'll be ingrained and just be part of how you operate. Reading for one issue at a time can help. I already talked about separating revision from editing, but once you know that there's something you need to watch out for, if you just read your draft for commas or for how you're starting your paragraphs, or how long and cumbersome you're letting your sentences get, whatever it is, if you know that there's something you need to work on, just reading for that one thing will help you catch a lot more things. And then when you catch it, then you can work with it. A lot of people also find reading your writing aloud useful. If you find yourself tripping, it forces us to slow down our reading. And if you find yourself tripping over things a little bit as you read, then that could be a sign that of an issue that needs further editing. This slide was definitely not meant to be like read. It's just a bunch of links, if you've got your hands on the slides, to some of the most common grammar and style issues. Because once you know what your tendencies are or what you need to work on, and if you know what it's called, you can look up a resource about it, and then you can give it some sustained attention and practice and come back to it, whatever that issue may be. And then to briefly touch on AI with writing. So clearly an emerging technology that is opening up a lot of possibilities and also a lot of issues. And if anyone is interested, when we get to time for discussion, or if you want to drop something in the chat right now, I'd be curious what your own experience is, or what your hopes are for AI, or what your worries are. But just to briefly touch on a few tips. One is to look up and follow the policies of the publisher and the journal. So the larger publisher might have their own policy of what is or isn't appropriate use for AI, and if they want you to disclose anything and how to do that. And then individual journals may or may not have more specific policies as well. Keep track of, if you're using generative AI, keep track of how you're using it, so you have that specific information to refer back to, and you can disclose it if and when that's needed. When you're prompting an AI, do so intentionally and thoughtfully. You'll get better output if you have better input, basically. And again, we can come back to talking about that more if you want. This one might be obvious. Avoid overuse of AI. And This is this is an issue, and it's an issue for those of us who teach. It's an issue with our students, but it's also an issue for academics as well. But it's out there. People are using it. I didn't put it in here and cite it, but it was really interesting when the big AI boom was first taking off. I read a study about how some of these specific words that are hallmarks of ChatGPT were, um, suddenly became a lot more common in scientific abstracts. So not only are people using it, but it's changing what scientific writing looks like um, as well. And to share just a few core principles to keep in mind, human accountability. So obviously, we're all accountable for things that we put our name on, and our human judgment, our human decision making, and intelligence and expertise uh, are more essential than ever. So it's worth thinking through um, where we're bringing AI in strategically, if at all, and where um, then we still need to exercise our own human judgment. Transparency. So again, a journal or publisher may want you to disclose and be upfront about certain uses of AI. And then finally, authorship. So AI models like ChatGPT or Copilot don't meet the criteria for authors. So it's again worth coming back to the idea that um, you're the author. This is one technology that's in the mix, but it can complicate authorship somewhat. So um, my main advice is that self-knowledge is half the battle. So identify your own tendencies and areas for improvement, whether that's something like, oh, I know I really struggle getting started, or I know I really struggle getting something that lasts 10% across the finish line, or I really struggle with writing these long, cumbersome sentences with lots of clauses, or um, transitions, or whatever it is. Knowing what your own tendencies and areas for improvement are, setting goals for ongoing practice. Again, if you know what something is called, then you can look up resources, and you can be intentional about giving it that practice. A few resources I wanted to share. The first two books I have images of here, Writing Science in the 21st Century by Christopher Tice, and Scientific and Medical Communication, A Guide for Effective Practice by Scott Mogul. Uh, I pulled from both of those when developing this presentation, and they go into a lot more detail about everything I talked about today more, but really useful resources for, uh, in particular, scientific research writing. The third book uh, on this slide, Style, Lessons in Clarity and Grace by Joseph Williams and Joseph Bizup. If you really want to work on sentence level language and style, so clarity, cohesion, conciseness, or clarity, cohesion, concision. That's the top resource that I would recommend, with lots of examples and practice for writers at any level. And then, of course, any style manuals for whatever style that your journal has you working with. I'm also partial in terms of online resources to the Purdue Online Writing Lab, or OWL. I used to work on it, but it's still one of the biggest and best resources on a lot of writing topics. Oh, thanks, Kent. Kent just dropped the link. Um, I I wanted to, since some of you were bringing up getting started as a a sticking point. I thought I'd include this meme, how it started and how it's going. So just reinforcing how difficult it can be to get started, how that can often be the hardest thing. So I think we have plenty of time. Um, so I'm fine with opening things up for discussion. We can come back to some of the things that you mentioned in the chat at the start. I can field questions, or we can, um, or if you have things to add, then that would be great too. So we can take questions or points in the chat, or if people want to unmute or raise their hand digitally or whatever you want. Right, Kent? I mean,
Yep, yeah, you could add questions
whichever.
to the chat if you have some, and or just ask directly.
While we're thinking about that, since a lot of you did mention that you struggle with getting started, I almost included a slide on that, and I didn't. But I have a I have one handy from another presentation, so I can pull that up if that's useful.
If I could, can I ask a question here?
Absolutely.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Thanks, Stan, for a really helpful presentation and some helpful resources. I had just an observation and then a question regarding the AI aspect. One just a little cautionary note. I was using ChatGPT to update my curriculum vitae in preparation for submitting it for a grant application, and was having it put in a better order and a better format my publications. And then I was reviewing what it did after I copied and pasted it, and it made up about 25 publications that I never did, and I was shocked.
Congratulations.
Yeah, yeah, I know. It's like I don't remember doing this research, and but it was with co-authors that were plausible, people I'd worked with. It
Yeah,
was stunning to me, and so just a caution about there was a hallucination, and
right.
I asked why I did that, and it said, well, these seemed like probable things you might have done. But I have used it for like researching various topics, helping me find resources. Is that typically being asked of to be disclosed? Like if you've used it to help find background information, find references, and is that something that most publications are wanting to have disclosed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you brought up some really good issues that I want to respond to, but um, I think it's still early enough that there's no one standard for that. I'm seeing different things, so I would just say, refer to if you're, these days, if you're looking to publish somewhere, look at both the publisher and the journal of what they're asking for, or just what they're listing as appropriate uses. Um, and then what they would want disclosed. I would think that in general, though, if you're just using it to generate ideas or answer, come up with information that then you're verifying elsewhere, hopefully, um, that would be relatively benign and not that big a deal. But yeah, you're bringing up a big issue that, yeah, I love your example because in the case of your, polishing up your CV, you weren't asking it to come, find sources for you the way that someone else might have been in a different situation. It's just worth remembering that, large language models, their the their focus isn't accuracy. You know, that doesn't mean everything's inaccurate, but it's doing math in order to predict what's a plausible string of language, right? Um, and I saw this. Uh, I've seen this with some of my students. And AI models are getting better to some degree with not just coming up with bogus sources, but it's still an issue. I had a graduate student I was working with who turned something in with some fake sources, and uh, it was easy for me to spot because it was on a topic I was writing about, and I thought, "Holy cow! There's an article by that author right on this topic that I hadn't heard about." That no, there wasn't. um, or I know that source. I know that that's not her first name because I went to graduate school with her, and I know that article wasn't published in that journal. Um, but talking to him, I realized he was using an AI tool called Connected Papers to help him find sources for his literature search. And I think that one was giving him real sources, but he was using like three different AIs. He was using Claude, he was using something else. And so he was feeding the sources he was finding in one from one AI into another, and somewhere along the way it got garbled. So yeah, that's definitely an issue. I don't know if that responded to what you were bringing up.
Yeah, thank you.
Daniel, can I ask you a quick question?
Please do. Yeah.
It's Steve Wunderlich. I'm at Stanford. And I appreciate your talk and a lot of good information about putting something together. I'm kind of wondering if I could get you to reflect for a minute at a kind of a higher level about the end product of our scientific writing in terms of communication to the audience. And that is, I read a lot of papers, I review a lot of papers, and oftentimes syntactically and grammatically, they're beautifully put together. It's like poetry. But I don't know what the message is.
Yeah.
I don't know what they're trying to tell me and the audience. And I know, audiences differ by journal, obviously, and sometimes people want lots and lots and lots of words, and a lot of stats and a lot of fancy stuff. But other times I think people are more interested in the message. So I guess my question is about when you think about scientific writing, what can you say about messaging and communication?
Yeah, and I appreciate that example, but I guess could you say more about what you mean by messaging?
Transmitting information to people in a way that's meaningful and digestible and understandable. Me, it's a matter of, I think you got to know who your audience is.
Right. Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I guess I have a few thoughts to what you're bringing up. One piece of what I think you're saying is that there's like sentence level um, clarity and correctness, and there's even, the clarity of individual sentences or paragraphs, but maybe those sort of the bigger picture messages of like what, in the case of research reports, what were you after? What were you even doing? What's the point of this? And what am I supposed to take away? Is that part of what you're saying? Yeah. Um, and I'll say that I realized I needed to work on that with one of my own manuscripts because um, I sent it, submitted it and got reviewers' comments back, and they were kind of picking at all these different edges, or didn't think that's or they were asking questions that I felt were answered in the manuscript. Like, what do you mean? I spell this out specifically in the methods that I did this, or they were asking me to pull in areas of literature that I thought were kind of in the neighborhood, but not exactly what I was writing about. And I ultimately realized that it was because it was those big picture things of what's the study after, and why, and what am I trying to do with it, and what could be taken away from it. Those those big picture messaging things that I think were getting lost for some readers that weren't already in my head or my co-author's head. Um, and so, but even the reviewers didn't realize that that was the problem. So they were finding all these other specific things that weren't clear to them, but the specific things weren't clear because the big picture wasn't clear. So I think that's why, yeah, you're talking about reaching an audience and certainly thinking through who your audience is, and there may be a primary audience based on your understanding of who would care about your study or who reads that journal. There may be secondary or tertiary audiences as well. Um, and remembering that even if you're not writing for a lay public, um, we're not, none of us, you know, um, we're all at varying levels of expertise uh, on on specific topics, right? But that's where uh, finding maybe finding someone to read each other's work and get a fresh set of eyes on it can be useful as well.
Sure. Thank you.
Anything else? Since a number of you mentioned getting started as a challenge, I I find my notes for sort of general tips for getting started. One, and many of these are ones you might have already thought about, but starting wherever you can, wherever you have the words, whatever is easiest to get over that hurdle of having gotten started. That doesn't mean necessarily starting at the beginning. Um, often methods are a great place to start because going through what you did, can be a sort of a comfortable starting point. Uh, Outlining, and we might think of outlining as like writing a formal outline, but my outlines start with um, sort of a messy list of things that I then start moving around and reorganizing and turning into something that is more formal. And then I actually often start drafting into the outline and it becomes a draft. Um, Mind mapping or clustering, or just making yourself right in that dedicated time, even if um, even if it's a mess at first, or even if you end up just writing about why you're struggling to start writing, it gets the juices flowing, gets you moving, it gets you going.
Daniel, that was a really effective presentation, and I appreciate it. It's Gary Schwartz in Grand Forks. A couple of things I would add. I am personally a favor of the stylistic moves that the British medical journals have taken on, that essentially force you, in addition to the abstract, to give 3 sentences. Why did you do this? What did you learn?
Mm-hmm.
What do we know now that we didn't know before? And if you can't give a clear answer to that, personally, I don't want to read what you wrote.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're really holding the writer's feet to the fire there by essentially saying almost bluntly that the purpose of scientific communication is to communicate new ideas. Tell me what we now know that we didn't know before, and say it in 500 characters.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a big fan of that. I'm also a big fan of, and it sounds weird, but the idea when you edit is to read the paper paragraph by paragraph backwards.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's very easy to be seduced by the beauty or perceived beauty of your own writing. And you can pretty much predict what comes next because you wrote it. You can't predict what comes next if you're doing it backwards. So I find that if you take each paragraph and say, well, how do I make this clearer, crisper, just as a writing tool, I like to edit my own work backwards.
Great. Thanks so much, Gary. Yeah, and I love that that idea that you brought up at the start of your comment of, Yeah, just those big picture bottom line stuff. Like you got a lot of details. There's always lots of details, right? But bottom line, what's the point? What do we know now that we didn't know before? What's the takeaway here? Yeah, because if if it's hard for you to articulate, then
It's impossible for the reader.
exactly, nobody else is going to figure it out for
Right,
you. Right,
right. And
right.
really, your job there is to sort of pre-chew the material, maybe even pre-digest it. And this is what I want you to know if you complete reading my article. And in fact, if you don't complete reading my article, this is what I want you to know because this is the DNA of it.
Yeah, and it might even help to, even if you're writing for a more specialized audience, like imagine for a moment that you're writing for more of a lay audience to force yourself to break it down to the essentials, right? And then to circle around to the comment about editing in reverse, yeah, that's a great strategy. You can even print it out and cut it up with scissors if you want to. Another thing that I do is create a reverse outline. If an outline is a plan for what the content of your writing is going to be, a reverse outline is where you go paragraph by paragraph, jot down the main idea in a nutshell, and then if you can, and if you're having trouble isolating what the main idea of each paragraph is, or if you're realizing that the sequence is wonky or something else, then that can be helpful.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Kenzie? Well, thank you, Dr. Kenzie, for the presentation today. And thank you to all the participants for joining. Just a reminder to please take a moment to complete the survey, and also the slides and handout link is available in the chat to Dr. Kenzie's presentation. Hope you all have a great day and hope to see you again on February 10th.
Thank you all. I also just dropped my email address in the chat. Very happy to follow up in any way.
Thank you.
Thank you.